Welcome to the TRSM Academic Success Center's coaching circles on tests and memory. This video is part 1 of 2 videos. In this video, we will discuss the memory process, the difference between memorizing and learning, and how to use Bloom's taxonomy to leverage your textbook's learning outcomes. In our next video, we will discuss test anxiety and how to overcome it. Let's start by defining memory and understanding the memory process. According to Merriam-Webster's dictionary, memory can be defined as the process of reproducing or recalling what had been learned and retained, especially through associative mechanisms. Without reaching into your wallet, can you recall what a $10 bill looks like? Do you think you'd be able to draw one? Although we may see coins and banknotes all the time and have many opportunities to learn their shape, few people could sketch one accurately. Looking at something repeatedly does not guarantee that we'll remember what it looks like later, or be able to recall specific details about it. Why can't we draw a $10 bill, yet recognize it instantly if we saw one? To solve this mystery, we need to look at memory as a 3-part process. First, encoding. Encoding is the process of putting the information into our brain using our senses, such as hearing. Then, we store the information in our memory. Finally, we retrieve the information when it's needed. Understanding these 3 steps and how to use them is essential if you want to improve your memory. So, how can we do this? Let's first unpack each of these processes. Encoding is our first contact with the information, and it usually happens through our senses. Encoding can be acoustic, which refers to how words or ideas sound. It can be visual, meaning the way the words or ideas look, or it can be semantic, having to do with the meaning of the word or idea and what we associate with them. The content of what we encode is then stored in our brain in neural pathways. Brain cells work together in a network to process information. When one cell sends signals to another, the connection between them grows. The more we stimulate them, the more we will remember. Conversely, when we do nothing to work on them, we forget. The storage stage of the memory process may be episodic, which relates to events or things that we've experienced. It may also be procedural, referring to motor skills and actions. Storage can also be semantic, which relates to general knowledge. Finally, retrieval is our ability to find or recall that information whenever we need to remember it, such as when taking a test. The more senses we involve when we study, the greater our ability to remember. Once a memory is created, it must be stored, no matter how briefly. Because we don't need to keep and remember everything we encounter, the different stages of human memory function as a sort of filter that helps to protect us from the flood of information that we encounter on a daily basis. There are 3 ways in which we filter and store memories. First, in the sensory stage, then in short-term memory, and ultimately in long-term memory for a limited number of memories. After that first flicker, the sensation is stored in short-term memory. Short-term memory has a fairly limited capacity. It can hold about 7 items for no more than 20 or 30 seconds at a time. You may be able to increase this capacity somewhat by using various memory strategies. For example, a 10-digit number such as 8,5,840,392 may be too much for your short-term memory to hold, especially with other distractions that may surround you. But divided into chunks, like that of a telephone number, may actually stay in your short-term memory long enough for you to dial the telephone or write it down. Likewise, by repeating the number to yourself, you can keep resetting the short-term memory clock. What's easier for you to recall? 8,005,840,392 or 800,584,0392? Important information is gradually transferred from short-term memory into long-term memory. The more the information is repeated or used, the more likely it is to eventually end up in long-term memory, or to be retained. That's why studying and reviewing material on a regular basis may help in improving test performance. Sensory and short-term memory are limited and decay rapidly. Long-term memory, on the other hand, can store unlimited amounts of information. Long-term memory may be implicit or explicit. With the help of our implicit memory, we may be able to walk, tie our shoes, or perform a number of the other daily tasks that we'd learned and practiced so frequently. They require little thought to complete. When we use our explicit memory, also known as declarative memory, we're consciously and intentionally recalling factual information, previous experiences, and concepts. As we saw, encoding is a process of imprinting information into the brain. Without proper encoding, there is nothing to store, and attempting to retrieve that memory will later fail. One way to improve the way we encode is simply to repeat the information multiple times. Scientists who study memory call these repetitions rehearsals of the information. However, as in the case of the $10 bill, many rehearsals do not always mean that you'll be able to successfully recall the information. What is the difference between remembering the image on the $10 bill and knowing our own phone number, for example? When you were trying to memorize your phone number, you did not merely look at it repeatedly. Instead, you deliberately tried to memorize it. In other words, you used your declarative memory. You may have read it to yourself several times. Maybe you attempted to recall it from your memory, checked whether you were right, and corrected yourself. Perhaps you noticed that there were some relationships between different numbers, such that some numbers were multiples or sums of preceding or following numbers. Or maybe you made up a rhyme or song to help you remember. Regardless of your choice, you employed certain cognitive strategies and processes. You still need repetition, but repetition was effective only when used in conjunction with these strategies. In an intriguing study, 3 groups of students were given a list of words. The first was asked to memorize the list and be ready for a test. The second group was told to categorize the words. The third group was told to arrange the words into columns. Neither the second nor the third group were warned about the impending test. So who would you expect would have done best on this test? What was found was that the memorizing and categorizing groups, so groups 1 and 2 respectively, performed equally well in the test, whereas the arranging group, group 3, performed worse than their counterparts. What the researchers found was that the students who were told to memorize actually categorized the words in the same way as the students who were explicitly told to do so in the second group. As a result, categorizing helped the first 2 groups of students encode the words better than arranging the words into groups had helped the third group, thereby allowing those 2 groups to achieve better test results. What this experiment shows us is that the mere intention of learning something is not what helps us remember it later. What matters is what we do with the material. Specifically, the strategies we employ to help us make connections and process the information. Effective long-term learning is rarely achieved by a one-off studying event, and we usually start to forget what we learned as soon as the event ends. It's an unfortunate fact first spotted and studied by German psychologist Hermann Ebbinghaus in 1885. Ebbinghaus found that not only do we have a learning curve, when we take the time to learn in the first place, but that we also have a forgetting curve, where we lose the information that we learned if we don't use it regularly. After learning something, our memory of it will decline over time unless we review it. The more we review it, the stronger we make the memory, and the quicker we can remember it. When exposed to the same material repeatedly, it takes less time to pull the information from your long-term memory. This is how forgetting is an issue of accessibility. The memory may exist in storage, but we can't find it, or can't find it in a timely manner. When it comes to studying course content, we need to engage our declarative memory through the use of as many learning strategies as we can recall. Something that will help us learn and minimize what we forget is spacing out our learning over time. This is a learning strategy known as distributed or spaced practice. Spaced practice leverages a memory phenomenon called the spacing effect, which describes how our brains learn more effectively when we space out our learning over time. When you introduce time intervals between study sessions, aka spacing them out, you can remember more, even if you spend fewer actual hours studying. Think of learning as building a brick wall. If you stack the bricks up too quickly without letting the mortar between each layer solidify, you're not going to end up with a very sturdy wall. Spacing out learning gives your mental mortar time to dry and boost up memory. Let's keep in mind that simple memorization does not guarantee grasping a concept. When we memorize information without thinking about it critically and making relevant connections, we're not really learning, just regurgitating. Regurgitation can lead to low grades because we don't know how to apply the content we had learned. Let's look at the simple business definition for the word tariff. A tariff is a system of duties of imports and/or exports. If we give this definition to a 5-year-old, they may memorize it as a song or a poem. However, they won't necessarily understand what it is they're reciting. The problem is that many students tend to study this way, and when it comes time to write exams, they often fail to answer correctly if questions are formulated even slightly differently than the way in which they had studied the material. Here's a question that may be used to test our understanding of the definition of tariff. Which one of the following are types of taxes? Notice how the word taxes was not mentioned in the actual definition of tariff. However, if we understood the definition, we will be able to answer this question. Let's try to answer this question in a logical way. This is also a good opportunity to practice answering multiple choice questions. Let's look at the way the question is formulated. Because they're asking for types of taxes, we can deduce that the answer must be plural. Reviewing our 5 options, we can see that there are only 2 answers that involve more than one choice, options D and E. If we go for option E, all of the above, we have to give the true-false test to each option to eliminate the wrong answers. Option A, GST, is true because GST is a sales tax. Option B, inflation, is false because inflation is not a type of tax. Rather, it's a sustained increase in the general price level of goods and services in an economy over a period of time. So we move on to option C, duty. Duty would be true because it's a type of tax imposed by customs authority of a country on imports and occasionally on exports to raise revenue or to protect domestic industries. Now, we know that the answer cannot be E, all of the above, so the correct answer is D, because both A and C are a type of tax. Instead of memorizing definition, studying them with these steps will not only help you understand and put them in context, but it will also be easier to remember. Step 1 is to make sure you understand every single word in the definition, in this case, duty. Step 2 is to come out with an example or fact where you can apply the definition. In this case, the US first imposed the tariff to Cuba in 1960 after the triumph of the Cuban Revolution. Step 3 is to draw an image that represents the example and attach it to the word. In this case, we have the branding of the Ministry of Tourism in Cuba, which is on most souvenirs and memorabilia on the island, that will help us remember the example and the definition. However, if you've not been to Cuba, we need to find an example that works for us and that in our head screams Cuba. For some people, this image would be an island or a vacation destination. For others, it may be a 1950s car or a sketch of Castro. Regardless of what this may be, the idea is to find an image that you can associate with the content, so that when you're writing the exam, you can visualize the doodle or sketch attached to the word. This exercise that seems so mundane is in fact a powerful strategy called dual coding that stimulates our brain via 2 channels, words and visuals. Have you ever studied hard only to perform poorly on the test? This common issue often has to do with the way we relate to the information we're studying. Sometimes we work hard to memorize data, only to realize that the test called for an analysis or application of the concepts and theories. To help students with this issue, the ASE has designed a learning aid that will assist in guiding your study strategies according to what your course outline or textbook learning outcomes demand. The infographic on the screen is available for download from our website under the tip sheet section. Feel free to download it and follow along. There are 5 components to this learning aid. First, there is a ribbon with instruction on the bottom of the page. On the left side, you can see a pyramid. This pyramid is called Bloom's Taxonomy of Educational Objectives, which we colloquially call Bloom's Pyramid. Bloom's Pyramid is a categorization of learning skills named after Benjamin Bloom, who was the chair of the committee who designed this model. Educators worldwide use Bloom's taxonomy to create learning outcomes that target not only subject matter, but also the depth of learning they want the student to achieve. On the left of the pyramid, there are synonyms to the various levels of the taxonomy. On the right half of the infographic, there are various learning strategies that correlate with the various levels of the taxonomy. These learning strategies are highlighted here in order to help students encode and process the material they're learning more effectively, so that it may remain in their long-term memory. Finally, in the middle, you will notice arrows leading from Bloom's Pyramid to the learning strategies. These are questions students should ask themselves pertaining to each level of Bloom's that would then connect them to the necessary learning strategies they would need to use to attain that level. In certain areas, you may notice red plus signs between various strategies. This means that they should be used in conjunction with one another. Now, let's look at this section in more detail, so you have a better understanding of how to use this to improve your ability to retain what you're studying longer. Before starting to use this learning aid, we encourage you to review the instructions at the bottom of the page. Step 1. Read the learning outcomes or objectives at the beginning of your textbook's chapters or those on your course outline. Textbook learning outcomes or objectives tend to be undervalued. However, they can be a powerful study tool to help you determine how to master the content of the chapter. Step 2. Identify the verbs in each learning outcome or objective. Verbs are words used to describe an action such as walk, sleep, think, remember, and so on. Step 3. Locate the verbs in a level of the pyramid and ask yourself the indicated questions. You may not find all the exact verbs of your learning outcomes on the pyramid. However, you will likely find them on the synonyms section of the diagram. The final step is to use the appropriate learning strategies when studying the material. To identify which stage your learning objectives are structured from, let's explore the pyramid's various levels and their corresponding synonyms. The base level of the pyramid is about remembering. To remember is to recall facts and basic concepts. Here are some synonyms for the word remember: to define, state, duplicate, list, memorize, or repeat. The next level is about understanding what you're learning. To demonstrate understanding, you would need to explain ideas in your own words. Some synonyms for understand include to explain, classify, describe, discuss, identify, recognize, or report. The third level from the bottom is application. To apply is to use the information in a new situation. You can't simply regurgitate what you'd learned at this stage. Some synonyms for apply include to execute, implement, solve, use, demonstrate, interpret, operate, schedule, or sketch. The fourth level from the bottom pertains to analysis. To analyze is to draw connections among ideas to demonstrate your understanding. Some synonyms for analyze that you may encounter include to differentiate, organize, relate, compare, contrast, distinguish, or examine. The second level from the top is about evaluation. To evaluate is to justify a stance or decision. Here are some synonyms for the word evaluate that you may encounter: to appraise, argue, defend, judge, select, value, critique, or weigh. The topmost level of the pyramid is about creation, creating a new or original work. Synonyms for create include to design, assemble, construct, conjure, develop, formulate, author, or investigate. In high school, the focus tended to be on the first two levels of the pyramid, to remember and to understand. We were frequently asked to memorize data. Anything from capital cities to formulas or equations to significant historical events. However, post-secondary education requires that we climb the pyramid from day one and move to the mid and upper levels of the pyramid to demonstrate our comprehension and learning. Remember that each level of the pyramid is not independent. Upper levels of the pyramid require understanding and usage of the strategies from the preceding levels. For each level, ask yourself pertinent questions such as these. Remembering is about recalling facts or basic concepts, so ask yourself questions like, what is the definition of, or what are the key terms? To understand, you need to explain concepts in your own words. Ask yourself, why is this information relevant? To apply your learning to new situations, ask yourself exactly that question. How do you apply this in different contexts? Analyzing is about drawing connections between various ideas, so ask yourself, which of these ideas have in common? It's equally important to ask yourself, what are their differences? This would assist you in strengthening your argument. Evaluation is about justifying your decision. To do that, ask yourself, given the information I have, can I determine the best rationale, plan, solution, or course of action? Finally, creating new or original work requires that you ask yourself whether you can synthesize the information in an original way, or how can a new outcome be produced? To attain that level of Bloom's pyramid and help yourself answer the questions we had identified on the previous slide, use these learning strategies. To remember, we have to highlight and underline to emphasize key points in the text, reread to review the information multiple times, and summarize or use keywords as these are most effective after pausing and coming back for a review. Keep in mind that if the learning objective asks for anything but remembering, or a synonym of remembering, these strategies here won't be enough to master the content. For the next level, To understand the concepts, we have to use all the strategies from the previous stage of remembering, as well as adding 2 more learning strategies. These strategies are to conduct elaborative interrogation, where you ask yourself why as you read, and to make sense of information through self-explanation. At the next stage, to apply your knowledge, you have to use the strategies from the previous, understanding, stage, as well as 2 more learning strategies. The first is to use concrete examples by collecting examples from the lecture or your textbook and brainstorming your own. The second strategy is called dual coding, which we had explored earlier with the definition of tariffs and the example of Cuba. It involves combining words and visuals. The fourth level pertains to analysis. To analyze, you're again using the previous stage's learning strategies with the addition of 2 more. The first is idea mapping, which involves the creation of a visual representation of the material or ideas and drawing connections between them. Idea maps, or mind maps as they're sometimes called, can be made memorable further by adding images and colors. For detailed information on idea maps, check out our coaching circle video on note-taking and mind mapping. The second learning strategy under analysis is about reaching logical conclusions about the information you're analyzing through deduction. Let's pause here and do another example. Here is a learning outcome from Chapter 1 of a Human Resource Management book. It reads as follows. After studying this chapter, you should be able to define human resource management and analyze the strategic significance of human resource management. The verbs in this learning outcome are to define and to analyze. Looking at our pyramid, we can find define as a synonym for remember, the base level of Bloom's pyramid. Analyze is higher on the pyramid. It's the 4th tier from the bottom. As we discussed, each level of the pyramid is not independent. Upper levels of the pyramid require for you to understand and use the strategies from the preceding levels. For this example, because we're being asked to analyze the strategic significance of human resource management, we need to make sure we're also using the learning strategies related to remembering, understanding, and applying. So how would we do that? We start by being able to define human resource management. We would first read the chapter. When we reread the chapter, we would highlight any relevant material, ensuring we're not highlighting more than 10 to 15% of the chapter. Otherwise, all we'd be able to see when reviewing and summarizing would be neon color of our highlighter. Next, we're asked to analyze the strategic significance of human resource management. As you may recall, analyze is the 4th tier of the pyramid. To get to the learning strategies there, we need to build upon the lower tiers, starting with understanding. After having highlighted, reread, and summarized, we engage in self-interrogation and self-explanation. We would ask ourselves questions like, why is HRM important? And explain what are the various components that make up strategic HRM. From there, we dive into application. To apply our knowledge thus far, we would come up with an example of strategic HRM and its benefits. When picking our example, we would create an image and associate words to dual code it for easier retrieval when we need to recall the information. Finally, to attain the level of analysis that's being asked of us, we would have to also mind map and deduce as part of our learning strategies toolkit. Our mind map may be comprised of the various strategic functions served by human resources management, anything from job analysis to recruitment and selection to retention and so on. Our deduction about the strategic significance of the human resource management function would be about reaching a logical conclusion for the information we have learned through the previous learning strategies. Try this for yourself the next time you're studying for a course. See how much deeper your level of knowledge of the content becomes and how much easier it may be to recall it when you need it most, because you had effectively encoded the information. Now let's return back to the pyramid. The 5th tier is about evaluating your knowledge. You're again building on the previous tier's learning strategies with a new addition. The new strategy involves you giving your own meaning to the information. When you're asked to evaluate or appraise, judge, or weigh a situation, what you're expected to do is to find a relevant course of action and being able to justify your reason for choosing it. Finally, the topmost tier of the pyramid is about creation. To create, we use the learning strategies of each previous tier and by adding 4 new strategies to further bolster our learning. The first strategy is imagining. The second is researching to investigate what others have done in this area. The third is about defining and developing to clarify your scope and put ideas in motion. The final learning strategy to help in creating is to test and adjust through feedback and modification. Nowadays, we talk a lot about innovation in business, science, and other fields. However, innovation does not mean reinventing the wheel. It's often about tweaking and improving something that already exists to reach a new outcome. This creative process can be applied to anything from an academic thesis to a business venture. For example, let's say we want to design our own app for grocery delivery. First, we imagine what the app may look like, what the interface may look like. Then, we research what other grocery apps are currently on the market. This is to help us brainstorm and come out with a feature that will make our app stand out in the market to the targeted demographic we want to attract as our client base. Next, we define our parameters and develop the app. Once we're ready, we have a soft launch of the app to test and adjust as needed, for example, to fix bugs and glitches in the system. Now that we've explored the memory process, the differences between memorizing and learning, and discuss how to climb Bloom's pyramid to effectively study course content, we encourage you to try it for yourself. If you want some support with the various learning strategies we've discussed, or general supports for test and improving your memory, please visit our center and book an appointment with a peer academic coach or with our learning strategist. Alternatively, you can also book appointments using the links provided on this slide. Thank you for watching the Academic Success Center's coaching circle on tests and memory. Check out our next video on test anxiety and how to overcome it.